My first book, Breaking Open the Head, was on psychedelic shamanism, and for that book I visited cultures like the Bwiti in Gabon, where I went through a Niboga initiation, and the Sequoia in the Ecuadorian Amazon, where I worked with ayahuasca, and the Mazatec Indians in Oaxaca, where we rediscovered the magic mushrooms back in the 1950s. And also I visited the Burning Man Festival, and I sort of started the book as an intrigued skeptic, and I ended the book kind of converted to shamanism, to a more kind of mystical or Jungian kind of understanding of the nature of reality, and kind of a sense that the psychic and the physical are very intertwined in a way that our modern materialist culture doesn't allow for. That's been an interesting perspective to hold because it's still quite controversial. I mean, in a way, like the whole psychedelic culture has been focused on kind of the medical therapeutic properties of these substances, and I think almost intentionally there's been maybe that's beginning to thaw, but for a while there was sort of an effort to just kind of table the whole question of what the whole mystical and psychic dimension and so on that they also kind of open up. So as I wrote Breaking Open the Head, I was particularly struck when I went down to the Ecuadorian Amazon, which I guess was like 99, and visited the Sequoia tribe, and I saw what had happened to their jungle through kind of the oil companies prospecting, finding oil, building roads, and then the forests being totally logged out, and then learning that this was happening routinely. These millions and millions of acres of rainforest would be sort of penetrated and annihilated to support the the demand in the United States for oil for about 2 or 3 days. And the forests don't regrow once they're gone. They become kind of like shrubland. They're really hard to do much with. So I guess that was like a culminating insight into kind of a sense that our system was on a kind of destructive or even suicidal path. And I then also became interested in kind of the prophecies of indigenous cultures, partially exploring the works of people like Terence McKenna and Jose Arguelles. Terence McKenna created this thing, Time Wave Zero, where he was looking at 2012. Jose Arguelles looked at the Mayan culture and kind of this idea that they were looking at this long count calendar that ended in 2012. It was a 5,125-year cycle that led to the beginning of another kind of world age or world cycle. And so I wrote a second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, looking at these kind of indigenous prophetic knowledge systems and kind of interweaving it with Western philosophical thought streams like Heidegger and Nietzsche and Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner and so on. And trying to figure out, I never in my work said that December 21st, 2012 was going to be an incredible cathartic moment where we would all activate DMT in our pineal gland or start floating or anything like that. But I saw that it was potentially a great invitation or opportunity for us to kind of take a different look at our social system and maybe reintegrate some of the knowledge from these older indigenous cultures and traditions. That came out in 2006, and I guess I just became more and more focused on this sort of ecological mega crisis, which now seems to be deepening and reaching kind of more and more profound level, which is becoming more harder and harder for the human collective to ignore. And once again, taking this Jungian perspective for a second, that we have to look at physical processes as also processes that are happening in the collective psyche as well as in our individual psyche, in a sense. From that perspective, I think we have to look at the whole ecological situation. And I'm just going to throw out some statistics and data. How many species are estimated to be going extinct every day now? It's like 150 to 200 per day. And they estimate there's 8.7 million, roughly, species on the planet. So if you do the math, that means every 10 to 15 years, we're losing something like 10% of the remaining biodiversity. And that's partially happening because a lot of the areas that are most under assault are areas with a great deal of biodiversity, like tropical rainforests, which are getting converted into soybean plantations and so on. The entire oceans of the planet are 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago because they're absorbing a large percentage of the CO2, the excess CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere, which is something like 1 million tons of CO2 per hour. What we now know is that we've had a 10,000-year Goldilocks period that allowed for the sort of development of human society and its growth to its present kind of global stage. And during that time, the amount of CO2 in the climate was 275 parts per million. Pretty much that was where it was at. Now we're over 400, and the last time there was this much CO2 in the atmosphere, temperatures were 4 degrees Celsius temperature warmer than they are now, which is 7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and sea levels were about 100 feet higher. So one thing that's really fascinating to me, having gotten so focused on this and studying it so much, is like, why isn't it common knowledge? Why aren't we talking about it? Why aren't we, I've become obsessively, fanatically fixated on it, but it seems like the most important things that are happening to us, to our future, to our children's future, is what's happening on this ecological level, and in a sense we're obstructed, we're blocked, we're not confronting it. It's too daunting. And what I find is there's two main bypasses that people are utilizing. One is this idea that technology is going to evolve to save the day, which has been kind of enshrined in this whole singularity construct. And I think it's a very pernicious and wrong idea. I think that obviously technology is going to have a crucial role to play if we're going to create a regenerative social system in the time we have before things collapse in a way that will be kind of irredeemable. But that technology has to be thought about differently and utilized differently. We should be more looking at, in a sense, low-tech often, but sustainable, kind of scalable technologies like rainwater harvesting, techniques like permaculture, rather than hyper-futuristic technologies like nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and so on, which has become almost like a form of a religious belief structure kind of permeating Silicon Valley and through Silicon Valley, the rest of the world. So on the one hand, people have this weird faith that technology is going to evolve so fast that we don't have to really deal with anything. We don't have to change our own behavior. We don't have to take responsibility. Then the other one is people think that it's too late. We're doomed, and therefore it's not worth dealing with the situation. I really think that both of those are very erroneous, and So we are definitely in a very short window of time where we have to somehow awaken the planetary consciousness to what's happening and bring about a collective shift, a kind of collective change of awareness and a focus on the situation, and then begin to scale the types of solutions that are actually available to us, which our society hasn't been able to deal with. Partially because we have a capitalist economic system which is hyper-focused on growth, which is based on debt, which basically forces us into continuous, unsustainable activity. So that's basically what I've been trying to figure out. I'm finishing a new book now, which I'm super happy about because it's been an 8-year struggle. I had a lot of the information, but even in my mind, I think it took a long time for me to settle down into the material and actually be able to be patient with it and patient with myself and just find a tone that's not, that's not off-putting to myself and everybody else. So we need a new paradigm. We have this technological singularity as one kind of mythos, and we have otherwise just the sense that it's all going to fall apart and we're in a doom spiral, which is not helpful. So what I propose is that we could look at the ecological crisis as an initiation for humanity. It's a collective process of initiation that humanity is undergoing, we've chosen to undergo as a species. And in a weird way, I do think subconsciously we have decided or made the choice to put ourselves through this process. Because we've known for decades now, the data has been very, very clear. Back to the Club of Rome in the early 70s, there's been so much profound evidence about our negative impacts on the biosphere. Although having said that, we didn't realize until quite recently the severity of all these kind of positive feedback loops and how quickly that was going to kick in. So right now we're seeing in the Northwest, tremendous forest fires, and also in California they've lost a lot of, almost entirely the snowpack, and other places in the world are beginning to lose their mountaintop glaciers and so on. And that's the water supply for obviously for like millions and millions, if not billions of people on the planet. The temperatures now are a little bit less than 1 Celsius warmer than they were on pre-industrial levels. And it's thought that if we go to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, that would be unstoppable chain of effects. So we're already seeing what nobody would have predicted is how fast these feedback loops are getting engaged. So that the forests dry out, they release carbon. Suddenly they're no longer carbon sinks. They're no longer holding carbon. They're releasing carbon. There's feedback loops like this we're finding around the planet. Another major one is the albedo effect in the Arctic. Right? When the Arctic is white, it reflects the sun's rays back into space, which keeps it cool. As the Arctic ice melts, it also begins to store heat more. And in fact, the Arctic is melting 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, which then leads to an even bigger potential problem, which is that there's huge deposits of frozen methane under the Arctic and under the oceans in the north that could start to release in large quantities at a certain point, which has happened in other epochs of mass extinction, like the Permian mass extinction 250 million years ago. And by the way, it's like, I wanted to be a surrealist novelist, basically. Like, I never particularly wanted to think about this stuff, but I just, my mind works in a certain way that when I began to, focus on it, it just seemed like, it's kind of what happened going back to Breaking Open the Head, like, I had these psychedelic experiences, they seemed so incredibly important, and I was like, well, why isn't everybody talking about this, and so I began to talk about it and write about it and so on, and I feel it's a similar kind of scenario here. And the tragic situation, or potentially tragic situation, is we actually, there's so much that we could do as a species to mitigate and ameliorate the negative impacts of what's happening. And as I said, I think framing it as a collective initiation is helpful. I mean, people who have gone through ayahuasca or to Burning Man or done intensive yoga retreats, I mean, there's a way that becoming uncomfortable, even self-willed paths of like suffering and misery, let's say, conscious suffering, conscious labor, actually it can be the most powerful experiences for inner growth, And if we're actually interested in maybe attaining or achieving like another level of consciousness, maybe what Eastern traditions talk about, non-duality, or kind of illumination, in Gnostic traditions, maybe this initiation crisis that we've self-willed is exactly what we need to induce us, force us out of our comfort zones, so we make a next step in the evolution of human consciousness to shift to a different frame of understanding and different frame of being and activity. We're in a culture of hyper-individualism, egotism, capitalist consumerism, and so on, which has led us to be very separate, from the Earth's ecology, from any relationship to our local environment, and so on. And that, could be a transition to, separating out from kind of the group identity of tribal people, which allowed us also to develop technology and science and our certain forms of knowledge systems, specialized knowledge and so on. But maybe that's all a transition to, kind of a next level of awakening till we realize that we actually are aspects of a planetary superorganism that's in a symbiotic relationship with the Earth's ecology as a whole system. And if we look at evolution as a paradigm, the kind of sort of technology, materialist, science crowd has been focused on this idea of like survival of the fittest, kind of Darwinian competition, but actually scientists, biologists, geneticists now, epigeneticists really see it differently, and they actually see that cooperation and symbiosis is much more the hallmark of evolution than competition and aggression. And you go back to the most magnificent example of symbiosis and cooperation is one that we're all stuck in today, which is our bodies. I shouldn't say we're stuck in. We're living together with them. I don't know what's the right way to say that. But anyway, so our bodies are trillions of cells and microorganisms that in a previous evolutionary stage were somehow competing with each other in the environment for scarce resources, and they learned during crisis to form more complex structures like skin and bone and eyes and so on. And here we are, in these meshed in these incredible, in a way, like ecotechnical artifacts that represent symbiosis to the most incredible degree. If we were to have this realization that we're a planetary superorganism and that we need to shift on a dime, essentially, from competition, kind of separation to cooperation and symbiosis, how could that be done? How could that be accomplished? What would be the tools for that? And then we can notice, when I wrote 2012, I was noticing kind of, these indigenous prophecies which talk about a transition from like the fourth world to the fifth world, or the age of the fifth sun to the age of the sixth sun. And it seemed to me that there were these things happening to our planetary community that represented or expressed this incredible transformation. One of them being the ecological situation, another one being the rapid evolution of technology, and particularly communications technology. Maybe all that capitalism will have turned out to be was the bridging mechanism that primitively and brutally meshed humanity together into one market, into one community spread out around the world. And then after the roads and the transport systems, the shipping lines were laid down, then the internet came in and the satellite communications and the fiber optics. So now we're instantaneously interconnected as a species in a way we've never been before. But we're still, the messages that the system is purveying are still the old messages of the mass media, of consumerism, all the stuff that we really know that we're going to have to stop at this point. Because, if we're going to look at what's really killing the planetary situation, it's the industrial systems, right? Like, we're extracting a huge amount of resources, we're converting, natural resources to toxic waste dumps and so on. We're going to need to go from, kind of this, even the UN's model of sustainable development to more of a steady state or a degrowth model, and that's going to involve a shift from, quantitative accumulation as a goal or as a paradigm to kind of qualitative experience as of more value. And I do think we're actually seeing that dawning on the species consciousness, particularly in the elite sectors, where people don't really want to own stuff that much more, so much anymore. They'd much rather, embody experience, like at Burning Man or all sorts of things. How would we make such a shift? I think we could look at it, through what has to happen technically, 10 minutes. What has to happen technically in terms of our infrastructure, agriculture, energy, transport, industry. We can break it all down. We can look at each sort of field as a subset. Energy, we now know that we could go to renewable energy in a few decades. Solar has reached grid parity in a lot of places. But we look around and we don't see, I walk around my city of New York City and I don't see, human colonies of ants, like happy bees or something, putting up solar panels and wind turbines everywhere, which is really what we'd like to be seeing right now. So it's blocked by the economic system. First of all, the best thing that we can all do for the planet is to basically stop eating meat. That's simply the low-hanging fruit. And but once again, I think as we go into this initiatory mode of engagement, we can really think about how much we can give up and actually feel proud of ourselves and good about ourselves for giving up. Eating meat, another one, which I'm guilty of, and I'm sure most people in this room are, is plane travel, unfortunately. Like every time we fly cross-country or transatlantic, we're expending 1.5 to 2 tons of CO2. The average first world annual budget of CO2 is 10 tons. So if we do 5 trips, we basically used up our CO2 budget of a first world person, which is already so much more than what a person in the developing world is using up. And unfortunately, very sadly, it's really like the West, Europe and America has gotten to hog these resources and use up the vast amount of CO2. And in our last decades of really unconscionable activity, interrupting these talks around the climate and so on, we've created a circumstance where we're in danger of causing what I would call passive genocide across a great deal of the developing world. So you have a country like Bangladesh, 160 million people. They didn't get Starbucks, they didn't get Burning Man, they didn't get to fly to Paris and Gstaad for skiing vacations. 160 million people who live at 0 to 5 meters above sea level. According to James Hansen, we're on track for he was the climate scientist of NASA and so on. We're on track for a 10-foot sea level rise by 2050. So what's going to happen to those people in Bangladesh who didn't get to have the fun that, quote unquote fun that our culture had, as their groundwater is entirely polluted, and India's already building fences to keep them out, So once again, it's huge, but we all have a role in it. And there is a capacity for a great awakening and a rapid transition of our socioeconomic paradigm and our technical support system. So we know, for instance, that shifting from industrial agriculture to organic or no-till farming, relocalizing food production, that would already have a tremendous impact on CO2 emissions. We know that the renewable energy is another piece. Taking a break from, we could have a global fast for a few years from meat and vacation. It wouldn't kill us, We could scale, we could decide collectively we're going to downscale the industrial system and only make the things that we actually absolutely need for those people who absolutely need them. I mean, one of the big linchpins for my thinking for the new book is Buckminster Fuller, who basically wrote a book called Utopia or Oblivion, and he foresaw that those were really the two paths for humanity, that either we were going to come together and create a planetary civilization that worked for everybody, or we would not make it as a species on this planet. And I think that is becoming more and more self-evident. It's not even incredibly difficult for somebody with a certain level of scientific knowledge to weaponize a kind of bioplague or something, and if we let the situation deteriorate the way it could, there's going to be an incredible huge number of incredibly pissed off people. So there's a huge communications kind of effort that needs to happen in the next few years. But one of the great values of I think the first time you take psychedelics is that tremendous sense of deconditioning and kind of deprogramming from the social constructs, and the realization that human culture is an artifice that we've constructed in a certain way, and we could actually construct it very differently. I mean, I think over successive times, unfortunately, the ego can learn to kind of assimilate or game the psychedelic experience in certain respects. And I kind of see how that happens after observing it for a number of years. But that initial opening into an awareness that money is an artifice, that our built environment could be, is actually kind of a reified ideology, that's a very profound realization. And it may be that psychedelics have a crucial role to play, in the next wave of awakening that has to happen. So in a way, you could all look at yourselves as emissaries of that process. But anyway, if we look at what consciousness is, it's interesting to realize that actually consciousness is something that's actually socially produced, and in a sense, the media system is a kind of factory that produces a certain level of consciousness or a certain level of subjectivity, and also syncopates the behavior of the multitudes, right? It kind of, from the mass media, from Sex and the City and whatever they watch, whatever people watch, they get an idea of how relationships are constructed, what's a proper model of relationship, how to relate to authority, what to buy, what cues to take, who to follow, and so on. So that actually, I think, in a way, it's kind of it's interesting because there could be the capacity to create a media that produces a different form of subjectivity relatively quickly, a subjectivity that's participatory, that's engaged, and also, once again, this fact that we've in a very short period of time built this interactive global media system, almost suggests like a self-organization, like an emergent property of humanity as a whole. It's providing the infrastructure for us to potentially make a rapid transition in social paradigm, with a new mythology, with a different kind of participatory subjectivity, and then with tools and instruments for that, such as ways that people can participate democratically, online through initial immediate referendums, new forms of tools for exchanging value that could supplement or supersede the current monetary tool, and so on. Through my shamanic work and psychedelic experiences, and even post-psychedelic experiences, I personally had a lot of, I would say, paranormal, psychic phenomena, psi phenomena. How many people here feel comfortable that exists? They've had some type of psychic phenomena or psi phenomena. Okay. So, one idea is that actually, I mean, that's what a lot of the indigenous cultures are focused on. Like if you go to the Hopi, their whole initiation culture was focused on, doing these kachina dances to bring rain in this very arid land. The idea is that you have to be kind of in another level of consciousness really resonant with your local environment, then you can actually make changes to that environment, such as bringing rain. And even though we don't understand how that could happen scientifically now, we may understand at some point. It may be that there's like a very subtle electromagnetic currents, bioelectricity, who knows, that works with our environment. So one idea that I toy with, and I just want to leave you with, is that it could be that we forced ourselves into this initiatory crisis as a species by creating this massive ecological catastrophe in order to, at the 11th hour and 59th minute, access these latent capacities of the psyche that potentially could be utilized in ways that we don't quite understand yet, just as people in the 15th or 16th century had no idea that electricity was coming. That it was only until the late 18th century that Benjamin Franklin put up his kite. We figured out the electricity existed. Then it took scientists successive waves of experiment to figure out how to transduce it, how to use it reliably, how to store it. So it could be the potential that we're at a similar kind of point with what you could call psychic energy, or psi, that it might be something that becomes usable and available as a power for humanity in the future. Steiner's idea of Ahriman. Steiner was an esoteric Christian, and he took the idea of a devil from Christianity, but he kind of opened it up and talked about different kind of occult or spiritual forces that are working on humanity all the time. One of them being Lucifer, Lightbringer, which is the force that pulls us up towards like beauty and imagination, and in a way you could look at psychedelics as very Luciferic, and Burning Man is like an incredible Luciferic playground in a way. But Steiner said there was also a force called Ahriman, which was from the evil earth spirit of Zoroastrianism or something, who was pulling us down towards minerality, material technologies, sterility. And yeah, I think you could look at the whole singularity construct as a very Ahrimanic, kind of deviation, I guess, from our proper spiritual path. But it's also very subtle and complex. It's not about rejecting technology, obviously. It's just about I'd say mastering our projections of technology. Recognizing that all of our technology is really kind of a materialization of consciousness. And then mastering it, so that it goes into harmony with the ecology of the Earth as a whole system. I really like the cradle-to-cradle philosophy of William McDonough, who talked about how we could create an industrial system where all of the effluents of that system fed back beneficially into the natural world. So then we wouldn't have a problem of sustainability. We would actually be in a state of like supernature, of abundance. The Pope has just done an amazing job in that respect with this thing that the encyclical Care for a Common Home, which is a very beautifully written document. And he kind of like went through the whole Catholic tradition and found kind of pieces that resonate with this idea that we have an ecological responsibility. I don't know where that's going to go, but there's I don't know more than 1 billion Catholics in the world. They could potentially be using their churches as a network for training people in permaculture practices. It's going to take a lot of kind of shocking, unexpected swerves like that, if we're going to pull ourselves out of the situation, because we're really looking at from the estimates of scientists now, at the current use of CO2. In 15 years, we've locked in 2 degrees Celsius temperature above pre-industrial levels, and at that point, we're really in radical, rapid climate change, acceleration, then leading to this methane eruption potentially. So we have actually a very short window, shorter than most people have recognized, to make a really profound shift in our practices, and it's going to take all sorts of unusual kind of alliances and developments to make that happen. My way of thinking about it has been more if we could influence the elite group that controls kind of the media and the networks, or create an alternative media structure, to shift the belief and the underlying beliefs and ideologies that people have, because most people, if they're just seeing the dream of, the American dream, the capitalist dream of accumulation, and that's what they want. I guess you would just have to talk to them about how you feel about the situation and one-on-one and say, look, this is where things really may be heading, and they could learn, other types of skills that might be more beneficial in what's going to happen in the next decades. Unfortunately, the West developed a radical lifestyle vision of rampant consumerism and material accumulation, and then we spent a century marketing and promoting that across the planet and saying that's what everybody should do, and after a few decades, that's what everybody wants. So those cultures like India and China both have a lot of countercurrents, traditional cultures. I mean, India still has a lot of like rural farming. There's a lot of cross currents in that culture. But the problem is you have what happens is that ultimately we've developed this kind of global parasitic elite class who are collecting the interest on the monetary system, and they're very much for this kind of status quo. I mean, China is interesting because it's such a totalitarian system. If the people at the top decide that it's going to become ecological, it's going to become ecological. So they could do mass reinvention of their factories. They're already building the largest solar facilities in the world and so on. In some ways, China could change very, very quickly. My vision would be that it would have to start in a way, the deeper level of a transformation would have to happen in a first world country like the US or Western Europe. We see some positive aspects of kind of a socialist system in socialist democracy in Northern Europe, like Scandinavian countries. But the world needs some other model of a direction. And I think part of it is it's like making that shift from the accumulation concept, which really doesn't, as we know, doesn't really provide lasting satisfaction, to re-embracing kind of mystical ideas, around what life is for, and actually, in the alternative model that we could evolve, people would have less work to do. I mean, like, people are very focused. Everyone's always talking about unemployment. If you're a politician, you have to increase employment. But actually, there aren't, in an industrial system that's increasingly automated, there isn't really work like there used to be for people. And that actually could be a great thing, if it was recognized that we were able to shift into like a post-work society where more focus was going on, self-cultivation, leisure, cultivated leisure, and so on. But I think that the first world is going to have to readjust. I mean, if we're going to make it as a species, and it's also, having gone through all of this, it's totally likely, quite plausible, perhaps most people would say almost, highly likely that, we're going to have a huge dieback, that we're not going to make a transition in time and things are going to go haywire. Neil and I were talking about that the other day. I still think that, we need to, from where we are now, plan for the best and have a vision for the best. And if everybody got on board for that vision faster, we could get there. There doesn't have to be a huge die-off of the human population, but it would have to be a kind of planetary revolution of consciousness and a spiritual revolution at the same time to bring about a transformation. And India and China have deep traditions, Taoism and Hinduism and so on, which could be tapped into, in the same way Catholicism is now available for this.